All right, welcome everyone. We'll give it a few minutes as people filter in before we get going, but really excited to talk to you all today. All right, as we give it a couple minutes for the stragglers, I had one question that I wanted to, a gotcha question I wanted to ask. If you want to answer, feel free to put it in the chat. We might make the panelists answer as well, just to see what they have to say. But my question is, how has working in broadband or having to think a lot about broadband affected your non-work life? So, are you better able to negotiate with the Comcast customer service? Or you have dreams about it? So I'm curious if anyone can answer that as a little icebreaker as we wait for folks to trickle in. Kirsten, I know you wanted me to call on you first, right?
Okay, I would say I almost get in a lot of car accidents because I can't stop looking at poles, see what's going on. And I go, oh, when I'm driving, and if someone else is in the car, they're like, what? That's about it. I cause a lot of stress on other people in my life.
Good answer. Good answer. Yeah, the pole focus is real.
I feel like that has made me arguably like the most boring person in my children's lives. We now go on vacation and stop to look at utility poles, and they really just think I'm now truly the lamest.
Oh yeah, the intersection outside of our office is being redone, and they're taking all the utilities and burying them underground. And I like at the window, I have a front row view of all that work, and I got, absolutely nothing done for the couple days when they were in the thick of it. So Ryan. All right, well, thank you all once again. We'll give it one more minute and then we'll get things rolling.
I was watching a show last night, The Good Wife, and there was a scene where she was trying to stream something, and it started to buffer, and it was like buffering very slowly, 10%, 20%, and then it got up to like 80, and then it started going backwards. And I got way more excited about that than I would have before I worked in broadband.
Wow. That takes the cake, getting excited about buffering. That's great.
It's like, this is why we need broadband.
All right. Go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, I was just gonna say I get tagged by parents of children on of a soccer team that pull me off on the soccer field and tell me that they don't have internet service and are looking for some tech support.
Stakeholder feedback. We will be talking about that today, I'm sure. Little League stakeholder feedback. All right, I'm going to pull a quick deck up. So just to give you all a run of show, we've got Ask Me Anything format here, where really appreciate everyone sending in questions as they registered for this. Feel free to put questions in the chat at any point as well. We're going to try to talk through as many of them as possible. But just to get us grounded, we're going to share a 4-slide deck just to review where we are in the BEAD and digital equity planning process as a country, give you a little bit of context about that. Obviously, everyone's state is different and on a different timeline, but we'll get through this deck and then get to questions. And we are very excited to have special guests from the Maine Connectivity Authority to help us look under the hood of what's going on in that state and give us some insights that we can use across the country for how this process is going and what people at every level and jurisdiction can do to participate. So without further ado, I'll just introduce the panelists quick. We've got myself, Alex Kelly. I lead the broadband team at the Center on Rural Innovation. My colleague, Kirsten Lardy, is a broadband consultant. We've got Stacy Baxter, Corianne Zacher from Next Century Cities, and they're sharing a few slides and some of their perspectives. And again, we're excited to have Andrew Butcher and Jessica Perez from the state of Maine. All right. I think first thing, I'm turning it over to Corianne to talk a little bit about the timeline.
Thanks, Alex, and hi, everyone. It's so great to see you all today. And I'm just here to break down some of the stuff that's been floating around. I know there's a lot of the word plan floating around. So I'm here to break down what some of those are. A couple weeks ago, you might have heard that NTIA announced the funding allocations for the BEAD program. So this was a huge step in helping states because now they know how much funding they're going to get. It was part of a huge effort to overhaul the national broadband map. A lot of states and local governments submitted challenges. So shout out to everyone on this call who might have gone through that process, because we know that it was not easy. And I hope that now you can see the impact that it's had on your state's allocation. If you haven't already checked it out, I'm going to share a version of the slide in the chat with some links so that you can look at the allocations for your state. And then now that we have allocations, we are really up and running with the planning, or I should say states and territories are up and running. We're up and running with trying to keep track of them all as they come out. So 270 days from NTIA's announcement, which works out to being December 27th. They will, 180 days. They will, states and territories will submit their initial proposal, which is separate from the 5-year plan that some states are working on right now. And in the slide, the version that I shared in the chat, you can actually look at which states have submitted their 5-year plans. But the 5-year plan is a little bit different from the initial proposal. It really just goes over a really broad view of what are the different funding streams that states are getting that have come from different places. So you might have heard that there are a lot of federal agencies right now that are giving out broadband money, and so states have the big task of trying to figure out who in their state's getting funding, how much are they getting, what programs is it going to cover. So you can see that in some of the states that have already put their 5-year plan out for public comment. So we've got Hawaii, Delaware, Idaho, Louisiana. We've got our friends from Maine on the call today, so I'm sure they'll dig into that. Montana, North Carolina, Ohio, and Utah have all put out their 5-year plans. So if you're in one of those states, definitely check it out. See if you can get your get some feedback to your state office. If you're not already in touch with your broadband officer, NTIA has a list of the contact information of every state broadband office and also the federal program officers who work for NTIA in that state. So definitely touch base with them because these plans are coming out in the next few weeks for some states, and then in the next couple months for other states, depending on when they got their initial planning funds, which happened last fall. But it was on a rolling basis, so we don't just have one date for that. So it'll vary depending on which state you're in. And then the initial proposal, there are a couple of states that are ahead of the curve on this. So Louisiana and Virginia have already put out their initial proposals, but these are the ones that will be due in December. So 180 days after the allocation period, which was the June 30th date. And this is going to have the details of the competitive grant process. So that's like, how is the state actually going to put out the funding? What sort of mechanisms are they going to use to give BEAD funding to communities and to ISPs and to serve different areas? So definitely keep an eye on that, because I know that a lot of states right now are doing listening sessions to get that plan ready. So again, just if you haven't already talked to your state broadband office, definitely want to emphasize that that's helpful. And I saw a question from registration about how regional partners can play a role in this. If you're a regional agency, definitely help local governments, because a lot of them have a lot of information coming in right now. So to the extent that you can help them, just flag this plan is up for comment in your state. Can you comment on what this means for your community? That's super helpful right now. And then 12 months after NTIA accepts the initial proposals, the state will submit their final proposal. So probably sometime in 2024, it might even go into 2025, depending on how quickly NTIA is able to process the initial proposal. And then sometime in between those two, we'll have state challenge processes. And I know that Alex and the Corey team will go into a little more detail on what the challenge process looks like. But if you have any confusion about the timeline, we're all happy to talk one-on-one to help this make more sense. I also think it's really helpful to look at some of the plans that have already been put out because they really have done a good job going through all the things that NTIA requires, even though they're a little lengthy. But especially if you're in a state that has a plan out, definitely check it out, see how it matches or maybe doesn't match what you're seeing on the ground and how you can provide feedback to the state. So with that, I'll pass it back to Alex.
Awesome. Thanks, Corianne. So there's a whole lot going on. Obviously, we've got the digital equity plans, the BEAD action plans, the initial proposals, and the final proposals. One thing that we want to spend one slide reviewing for everyone's context is what is going in the initial proposals, because this is one of the most important junctures for everyone to provide feedback to their states. And what's in the initial proposals will really dictate how the funding rolls out. So this is not a comprehensive list. And once again, the process is made a little bit more confusing by having different portions to the initial proposal. So you may see states, and we have seen states release the volume 1 already. They may release volume 1 and volume 2 at the same time. And so just be aware of all that. So I wanted to really quickly review what is going to be in the initial proposals. This is not a comprehensive list, but for everyone's awareness, volume 1 is supposed to do, among other things, document the existing broadband funding in the state from a variety of sources, past federal grants and programs, past state grant programs and funding mechanisms. It's supposed to document what the state is acknowledging as unserved and underserved locations, as well as community anchor institutions. So far, the states that have put out their initial proposals have done this by linking to spreadsheets. And so we'll see if that trend continues. And then it's also supposed to outline the first draft of the challenge process that they want to use for entities to challenge the conception of and underserved locations. And we've got a whole slide on this because it's really important, so I'm going to move on. The initial proposal volume 2 contains a lot of things, including how they're going to run their grant program and select the ultimate recipients of BEAD funding, details about how they're coordinating or how they have coordinated with local and tribal units. There's a lot in the BEAD NOFO about labor standards. And so how the state is going to grapple with that, enforce that, measure that is in initial proposal volume 2, as well as workforce readiness. The climate and disaster resilience portion of the BEAD requirements, the BEAD NOFO goes in initial proposal volume 2. That's things like how are you taking into account disaster resilience in the award process and the awards you're going to be making, as well as what are you looking at in terms of middle class affordability? How are you defining that? And how are you incorporating that in the process? There is an initial proposal, volume 3, which is optional, but I have a feeling that a lot of states are going to go after it, which basically allows you to unlock 20% of your state's allocation. And to do that, you have to submit a project plan, a narrative, and budget requests. So essentially, this is what we're going to do with that 20% of our allocation. So be on the lookout for these components coming out of your state broadband offices. They're all super important to review, understand, and provide feedback on as appropriate. Okay, now on to the NTIA's model challenge process. The reason we wanted to go over this in detail is because from what we've seen so far, the states that have put out their initial proposals are adhering very closely to what the NTIA has put out as a template challenge process. So, and there's a lot of nuances here, and one important thing that I would just say off the bat is we all know that the maps currently have a lot of challenges still. They will always have challenges to them or problems with them. It will be incumbent on everyone to continually try to help make those maps the best they can be so that your community gets all the funding it deserves, that you can fund locations that really need it, and so forth. And so if you are embarking in a planning process this year that includes data collection, it's really important to know what types of data are going to be valuable and how the process is likely going to work, so that you don't collect data that ultimately can't be used in your state's challenge process. So in the NTIA's model, which again, some states are looking like they're going to adopt, other states will not. They'll come up with their own process that's more tailored to their context. There's a few important things to note just about, at a high level. One, the NTIA is suggesting that you have to be either a local government, tribal government, a nonprofit, or a broadband service provider to challenge the state map directly. So that means that they are suggesting that these entities are the ones that kind of collect information from the last mile, right, from people on the ground, and then submit those challenges. Notably absent from here is a way for an individual to challenge the data directly, right? That is true of the FCC's map, but at least in this model challenge process, they're suggesting that individuals go through these kind of other entities to provide challenges. And then as far as the types of challenges, 4 main things here, right? Eligibility of existing broadband serviceable locations, right? Are they served? Are they unserved? Are they underserved? And what are they eligible for? Community anchor institutions, right? Where are they? Do they need service? Enforceable commitments. So that could be like a location is marked as being covered by RDOF or intended to be covered by RDOF, and people on the ground or local government has a different conception of whether that location is actually included in an RDOF award, right? That's challenging an enforceable commitment. And then planned service, right? So where are expansions being built right now, and therefore don't need to be included in the state BEAD process. The next slide here I have is, I'm not going to go through this line by line, but we'll send this out. This is a proposed process for the challenges that I just outlined. So at a high level, the NTIA is suggesting that states first publicly post the process, right? Including the timeline and instructions for at least a week before they open the portal. So the first phase is publication of eligible locations and served location. These are the data sets that I mentioned earlier that show every eligible location in the state, as well as enforceable commitments and so forth. Phase 2, which the NTIA is recommending is open for 30 days, is the challenge phase. So this is where those entities that are eligible to challenge submit challenges through the portal and through the process. How that works exactly is gonna change by state, but so I won't go through all of these bullets for how the NTIA suggests it, but essentially they're recommending challenge phase opens as soon as a challenge is submitted for an address. That address goes to the rebuttal phase, which is where ISPs can rebut what people, if they believe that the challenge is in fact in error, they can rebut the challenges. So if those challenges are rebutted, it changes the status of that location to disputed. If the ISP decides not to rebut those locations, the challenge becomes sustained. That's just the terminology they use. And then lastly, there's a final determination phase where the broadband office adjudicates all the remaining disputed challenges and basically comes up with their final list. Now, 3 important aspects of the challenge process that the NTIA has offered as optional modifications are on this slide, and we wanted to go through this because they contain some of the more nuanced and important elements that are likely going to be involved in every state's kind of challenge process. First of all, states can, the NTIA suggests that states can come up with some rules only for their state about what they consider served, underserved, and unserved. And they gave some examples here, right? States can classify DSL locations as underserved no matter what. For example, right now with the federal map, DSL can be marked as served if it's within, I believe, 6,000 feet of a central office. Sorry if that's getting too technical, but basically states are given the leeway to say, nope, we're just going to call all DSL service underserved. And then the NTIA suggests also that states may use speed tests as part of their challenge process. Now, the way they've suggested using speed tests in their template is a little bit tricky. It's a little bit onerous, but essentially they propose a process where individuals take 3 speed tests on 3 different days and then use the median test results to make the claim that they have service that either qualifies them as unserved or underserved. There's a whole lot of suggested rules behind this about what tier packages you have to be subscribed to in order to challenge those classifications. But essentially, the point of this section is to say that many states will likely be establishing a process for using speed tests as evidence. And then lastly, there's, as many of you know, there are a lot of challenges with multi-dwelling unit buildings and whether they're served or not. So the NTIA proposes a process for handling that. So, you know, if you've tested or you've gotten survey results from 10% of the units in a building, you can submit challenges, and they've got a similar process for submitting a challenge for a certain area. So they're suggesting that if 6 or more broadband serviceable locations within a census block submit the same type of challenge, and those challenges are sustained, you can consider the entire census block challenged and sustained. Okay, I'm going to pull this down and stop talking, and we're going to get into our discussion. So I am thrilled again to welcome Andrew and Jessica from the Maine Connectivity Authority here, and I'm wondering if we can start by just flipping the mic over to you to give us a little peek of the process, what you've done so far, and what you're working on now, just to give other folks some perspectives about what your day-to-day is.
Sure. Thanks. Thanks so much for having us. Seen many familiar names in the attendee list. Andrew Butcher, I serve as president of the Maine Connectivity Authority. Jessica, you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. I'm Jessica Perez. I'm the Digital Equity Manager at MCA.
Alex, before I go down any particular road, are you looking for us to, would it be helpful to chat through only what we're doing as far as the BEAD planning process and the broadband action plan, or would you like a comprehensive snapshot of us as a agency?
Oh, I think 30 seconds on the agency would be great. And then transition to the planning process. Perfect.
Great. Well, folks, you'll be glad to know that Jessica and I prepared a very detailed and in-depth 50-minute presentation. So buckle up. We are very glad to be joining you. Thanks to the Corey team for the invitation. We don't have a real formal presentation, but are happy to talk through some of our experience through the broadband action planning process. Before doing so, just to clarify, we are your main broadband and digital equity agency. We are the designated eligible entity for the state of Maine. We serve as the broadband agency and office for the state of Maine. We are a relatively new agency created by statute in 2021. And operationalized in early 2022 with me starting in my role in January of 2022. We are very fortunate to be building upon a strong foundation of broadband planning and infrastructure development in Maine through a office that was in the Department of Economic and Community Development, which, certainly before the pandemic had been a strong but mighty office of 1.5 people. That had largely been deploying very limited funding for facilitating community planning processes. I was fortunate enough to help run a state bond campaign in 2020 to generate $15 million for the state of Maine. It was the largest amount of public funding for broadband in Maine as of 2020. Certainly with the pandemic and the recognition of how dependent we are, our legislature and governor moved quickly to create a new agency to be robust and proactive in being able to receive recovery, relief, and infrastructure funding. Since that time, we have stood up and scaled up pretty quickly. As employee number one, my first job was to open a bank account. Second job was to build a team such that we could receive and deploy close to $500 million worth of federal funding. To that extent, we have absorbed prior grants and programs through the former office, as well as have received our capital projects funds and state and local fiscal recovery funds through the American Rescue Plan, and have put those funds to work. You can see more about that under our funding programs on the website, really trying hard to build from a Maine model, which has prioritized a community-informed process to both aggregate demand and help facilitate strong public-private partnerships. So I'm very pleased that since operationalization, we have deployed over $100 million to facilitate over 53,000 connections throughout the state. Simultaneously, of course, we have been building out the capacity to receive and deploy our BEAD funding. And so happy to talk more about our non-BEAD or digital equity work if folks have questions. How we braid those programs and those funding sources and activities is really a key to success. And so I think as states are thinking about that, happy to share some perspective if folks want. We are, of course, now in a world where we are bridging broadband work through the American Rescue Plan in preparation for the infrastructure law and the BEAD program. Maine is a state that did receive our planning funds for digital equity and BEAD. We chose to anchor our broadband action plan, our BEAD plan, around our digital equity work and priorities, and effectively facilitated a planning process jointly between those two plans, because there's just not enough time and bandwidth in the world to talk about multiple planning processes in tandem. And so wanted to make sure, as we were engaging stakeholders and partners through that process, that it was clear that they were part and parcel. Now, it's been our work to make sure that we are delivering on the BEAD planning requirements as well as the digital equity plan requirements as well, both of which I shared a link in the chat. Both of those plans and the associated data collection efforts are posted on the website. And we're well on track for translating our broadband action plan into the state challenge process and the first version of the initial proposal, as well as parlaying the digital equity work and planning into some of the next steps outlined in our capital projects funds. So at a very high level, I think it's just important to highlight that we are currently bridging our capital projects fund strategy and programming to a BEAD planning process, to the BEAD implementation phase. One key way we'll be doing that is also focusing on building out and enhancing our middle mile infrastructure. We are a state that put forward a competitive proposal through NTIA's middle mile grant program, and we're one of the the 30 awardees of that funding. And so middle mile will be a key way in which we are addressing some of our BEAD priorities as well. With that, Alex, I'm happy to take your cue as to where and how you'd like us to drill into any aspects of the broadband action plan process or the digital equity plan.
Sure. Well, Jessica, do you want to say anything about the digital equity planning side of things, or we can jump to some questions?
Sure, happy to do that. And I also see a question that asks about the digital equity plans.
Yeah,
I can try to get two birds with one stone. So, you know, Andrew was referring to doing these two plans in tandem because it's a more efficient process, but it also really centers the fact that we can't be thinking about infrastructure without thinking about the users at the end of the day. And so we have been ensuring that we get feedback from folks on both the digital equity side and the BEAD side. And so earlier this year, we put together a plan to get input from lots of stakeholders and lots of individuals. We put together a digital equity task force to help inform the plan. We had input from working groups. We partnered with regional organizations to get them to put together digital equity plans that could then be incorporated into the state plan. And then we did a survey that went out and we got over 3,000 responses. We did focus groups with over a dozen different organizations. And then that all went into the draft of the plan. And so that plan became available at the beginning of the summer. It had about a month-long period for folks to provide feedback and input, during which we also went back to some of those stakeholders and said, please look at the parts where you gave us input and let us know if we got that right. And now we're working to revise that so that we can submit it this fall.
Awesome. All right, we've got some great questions rolling in. We'll tackle the ones in the chat and then we'll go to the ones that were sent ahead of time. Looks like Kirsten answered the question about the challenge process already and whether that's open for public comment. Thank you, Kirsten. Are states allowed to collect more data than what would be allowable by the FCC and use that in their challenge process? The short answer is yes. Does anybody want to give a more elaborate answer or add to that?
One, Alex, if I may, one point just to add on that front is so it's a loaded question in part in that yes, states are allowed to, and the speed testing point that you brought up earlier does point to that. And so yes, states are allowed to incorporate additional data into their challenge process, and the locations that are deemed eligible for funding are still, they are assigned a specific location identification, and so only those locations will be eligible to receive funding. So it will inform the state challenge process so that states can choose their own parameters, and the funding eligibility will still be only limited to that data set from the FCC.
Right, that's a great point. That's if you have not already made sure that the broadband serviceable locations are as good as they can be for your jurisdiction on the FCC's map, please do that. We've talked about this before. We're happy to have a one-on-one conversation about the ways that you can try to do that, because if it's not on the map as a location, can't be funded, right? So I think it's a great point, Andrew. I'm going to mark that one as answered. Is there a suggested time that the NTIA put forward to speed tests to be taken? If there is, are there any concerns with that? I'm happy to answer this one, but for the sake of anyone else who wants to chime in, anyone want to take this? All right, I'll take it. So the NTIA has one suggested time frame for taking speed tests, but it's actually for the rebuttal process. So as an individual, again, and this is just their template version, 3 speed tests over 3 different days. Obviously, if you are trying to prove that your broadband is is slower than the FCC than your state says it is, you may want to pick a busy time to do that. And for the same reason, the rebuttal, if the ISP is going to submit speed tests of their own to rebut that, the NTIA has suggested that those speed tests be taken between 7 and 11 p.m. And that's just because that's a busy time. So what they're essentially saying is, if you want to claim that you're providing 100/20 service, that service better stand up in the most high trafficked time. Yeah, Andrew.
Yeah. Oh, I didn't mean to. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you short.
All good.
I was just going to add that that in particular was a point that NTIA had shifted in the time period of their posting of the NOFO and public comment. And so states and the coordination between the states had, I think, a helpful level of input in refining and adjusting that parameter.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's a great example of where like public feedback actually really works, and it gets it gets listened to. It's not always listened to all the time, but good example of improving the process, hopefully based on that feedback. I'm going to switch it up and ask a question that was submitted ahead of time because I think it's a really important one, and I'll call on Kirsten to answer first, and then maybe see if the folks from Maine have anything to add. The question is essentially, what are we seeing about states using the template from the NTIA versus creating their own processes, and do we have any thoughts about that?
For the most part, what we've seen so far, which we mentioned before, is that states are following these guidances, but we do expect variance as more states come out with plans. So just keep an eye on that, especially when it comes to how they're going to do the challenge process and also subgrantee selection.
Yeah. And I think turning it over to the folks from Maine, we talked a little bit about this before. There's a real balance between trying to get your proposal out quickly, and therefore maybe using the templated guidance because that'll be approved, and creating something that's more bespoke and tailored to your particular context. So maybe Andrew and Jessica, how are you thinking about this tension?
Yeah, thanks, Jessica. I'll take this, and if you've got other points to add, feel free. Alex, we had a good conversation about this last week as we were chatting and prep for today, and I think I would emphasize this very real challenge in balancing the urgency and needing to be able to access the funds and being able to start facilitating the process. There's really no way of getting around it. BEAD is a beast. This is being identified as one of the most complicated and onerous telecommunications funding programs ever. And it's like, all in like $60 billion worth of public investment for once in a generation, if not once in a lifetime, critical infrastructure. So it's probably necessary to be embarking upon a program with such rigor. And so we are very much trying to balance the urgency with being able to access the funds with being as targeted and intentional and strategic around where and how to deploy them. Maine is a state, for those that don't know, Maine has the highest concentration of rural population in the country. We also have one of the, if not the oldest population in the country. So our challenges in deploying these funds are very real. Our need is very, very high. And so the state challenge process, the model challenge process, as Kristen, as you identified, NTIA has made it clear that not changing or adapting the model will make for a more efficient reception and deployment of BEAD funding. And capital absorption is going to be a very real challenge, especially in a place like Maine, where we are seeing not just the capacity on the community and on the public front, but capacity on the actual internet service provider front being a very real challenge. These are not just soft money grants that, get the money and do the work. The tail of reporting and requirements and the complementary set of requirements associated with this is a very real step up for our internet service providers, for our communities, for our regional partners. And so taking the time to build that capacity, especially if we're layering a set of objectives and impacts around digital equity into the work, is going to be really important. So we are seeing a very real value both in adapting the state model, the challenge process based upon our parameters and needs, as also a way to make sure that we are building out the capacity in the sector at large. And that allows us to both continue executing, delivering and deploying capital projects funds as quickly as possible, designing and building and standing up a new middle mile infrastructure as a key part of building out that capacity. So I think that the work itself is pretty tough, but I think all the more reason why it's pretty critical that states and partners at large are thinking about how to braid resources to optimize impact. Jessica, I don't know if you had any other perspective from a digital equity standpoint that you wanted to layer in as well.
I feel like that covers it.
Awesome. All right, back to the chat. I'm going to flip it over to you, Corianne, to talk about advice for states that are just beginning their local engagement efforts. And yeah, take it away.
Yeah, and thank you so much, Alex, and everyone else so far. So this is a really great question because every state has had to grapple with this over the last year. And I think the best advice I can give to people is look for people who are already in the community, who have already established relationships with the people who are going to be impacted. So librarians, teachers, social workers, all of those people who are already working with people who are disconnected have really good insights into not only like what are some of the big picture things that are happening, but also who are other organizations that need to be a part of the planning process. And if you look at some of the plans that have already gone out, you can kind of see the types of organizations that are partners in other states. I think that's a really good guide, but it really varies. Like I know one community we work with, they don't have curbside trash. They have everyone drops their trash off at a central recycling center and trash facility. And when they did their broadband planning before BEAD, they had people standing outside of the trash facility, and when people dropped their trash off, they would ask them about broadband. And it was just a place in their community where they knew they could reach people, and they were able to ask them really good questions. And they have a municipal broadband network now, in part because of that effort. So I think you really have to think about what makes sense for your community. What are those places where people are convening? Who are those people who already have relationships established that you can lean on? And also, how can you support them? Because I think it needs to be a two-sided approach where the state is also helping some of these local entities and not just going to collect information, but also thinking about how can this become more of an ecosystem of people working together to solve the problem. And I'm happy to jump into some of these other questions, but I'll pause because I'm sure the main folks have things to add on that question.
I can respond as well. I really like the creativity involved in meeting people at the trash collection, because it really is about meeting people where they're at. And we found the same thing when we, were partnering to collect the digital equity input, which was that we needed to be really creative in how we considered who to ask to be involved. Because if you think about digital equity organizations, they're usually pretty small in number. But when you think more broadly about organizations or entities that might be doing something else as their primary mission, but then end up doing digital equity work as a portion of it, then you really get more expansive and more inclusive. And so, one of the things that we heard, for example, during our focus groups was that people were finding out about the Affordable Connectivity Program, which is an internet discount program, from their doctor. And so we needed to make sure that we were communicating with health centers and clinics, because those were areas that was the conversation that was happening, but it wasn't necessarily the most obvious answer when you think about digital equity organizations.
If I could just add one additional point on that, Jessica, because it's such a good point and sort of speaks to a broader set of, I think, strategy that we've tried hard to recognize. Most of us don't start our life or our careers working in broadband or digital equity. For those of you that have, then I'm just so envious of the timeline of which you've been able to be able to contribute. But I think from our team's perspective, most of us have worked in community economic development, nonprofit, public sector in some capacity or another. My background is entrepreneurship and community development. And if you are asking for partners to be involved in a planning process, that involves collecting information, sharing information, spending time. That's a very real commitment of time that should be regarded as a premium for their service and their time. And so even though we are largely an infrastructure planning, development, and investment organization, it's pretty important for us to be investing in the health of the ecosystem of both subject matter experts and the organizations to help spread the word. And so we've tried hard to capture some of that through our regional and tribal broadband partners program, which is investing effectively time for organizational capacity to engage and participate in a number of different networks, whether it's our digital equity task force, or a community of practice among those organizations. It is very real time, and I can't underscore the value of trying to make sure that you are justifying and preserving that time among those partners such that they're able to participate in a meaningful way.
Great. So we had a really interesting question come in from the registrants that I want to tackle, and then we'll continue with questions from the chat. But the question was about workforce readiness and what that means and how to think about it. And I love this question because I think it's not only one of the ways in which states and even regions can make their BEAD deployments better, smoother, and more efficient, right? To make sure their workforce is as ready as possible. It's also one of the issues that will take the longest to address. And so it's important for everyone to be thinking about now. So our organization has done workforce readiness analyses kind of under for various states, where they will say, well, if you spend $1 billion or $2 billion on broadband over this time frame, based on your workforce now, what jobs are you going to need to add and what job categories? And that's meant to get kind of proportionally and directionally accurate about the kind of ways you need to grow your workforce. But it's a lot of work and it's a big undertaking. And I think my advice for states who, or regions who just need to get some things moving in a fairly easy way, is to talk to broadband construction contractors. And the reason I say that is we've heard reports from state broadband offices that when they go ask the ISPs, how's your workforce and what do you need and what training programs do you need and what would help? The ISPs, especially the big ones, say, oh, we're all set on our workforce. And they say that because they don't want to admit or be totally transparent about the workforce challenges, because they don't want to risk being given more grants if the state broadband offices find that they might not have the workforce to complete them. However, the contractors who are out there building all over the place, very often, they know exactly the types of roles they need, because they're trying to hire constantly, and they will tell you, we think we need to hire 100 tower climbers and so forth and so forth and so forth. And that's just really good data to run with and to then take to community colleges, technical training providers. There are and they'll also tell you like what types of licenses and certifications are meaningful and what aren't. And so that's a great place to start in terms of thinking about workforce readiness and how to approach that challenge. All right. Go for it. Yeah.
Alex, I'll be, by the way, we're so appreciative of being the state representation on this call. Feel free to shut me up if if we're chiming in too much.
Oh, no, great.
Just a couple things that we've been trying to think through, to your point of really trying hard to make sure that we're doing a industry-driven analysis of the workforce gaps. We have two big objectives. One, to make sure that we're able to place people in education, training, and employment opportunities. And two, to increase the supply of human capital in that pipeline. I shared a link to the workforce analysis and strategy that we completed earlier this year. And that's on the sort of identifying the jobs and the gaps. The work in identifying, more people to step into those roles is the work that we are all needing to do, and is a chronic challenge for a state, especially like Maine, with like a 2.3% unemployment rate, and an aging population. But so like finding more people is the fundamental challenge for workforce development. And so I think a key to doing that is through a number of collaborations, right? Like the infrastructure that we are deploying is very similar to the infrastructure that our renewable energy and grid modernization partners are looking to address as well. That allows for us to have a more cohesive set of training curricula to bring to training providers and schools like our community college system, which has been a really aggressive and open partner to thinking about adapting curriculum. So aggregating demand across sector allows for a more targeted set of collaboration with community college systems and other employers and or employer training providers, because the key to success for everybody is on the job experience.
Yeah, amazing. And I would also say that a lot of states are really thinking hard about how they can diversify their construction workforce, because there's, the typical profile of a line worker is not taking advantage of the full breadth that our population has to offer. And so getting all hands on deck with broadband construction means diversifying the broadband workforce as well.
And that's a natural opportunity to also collaborate with the digital equity planning.
Yeah, love it. All right, does anybody want to talk about the low income plans and middle class affordability measures, which someone asked about in the chat? This is a tricky one.
Right now, we're focusing our energy on the Affordable Connectivity Program, because that program currently exists. And so we want to make sure that we can get all people who are eligible on that program the opportunity to use that resource. And so I'd say that is where we have been focused at this point. And then we will probably use elements of that program to help us determine what a middle class affordability program would include.
Yeah, I think there is a real lack of national resource and thought leadership on what some of these things actually mean. I would love if any academics out there are listening to figure out how we can refine things a little bit more. HUD, for example, has a measure of what an affordable one-bedroom household is, or rental unit is, by location, and they've put together kind of a nuanced analysis of what's affordable in each location, and we need more information. We need more research to really figure out how to do that in telecom and in broadband, in my opinion. And states are obviously working really hard to do that, but that this is where other partners can come into play, research universities, et cetera.
And I'm happy to jump in with what we hear from communities, because we always try to ask communities what's affordable to them, because it really varies from place to place, just like housing varies depending on where you're at and how much it costs. But we have sort of heard of 3 big buckets, which are that broadband in general needs to be more affordable, and there needs to be more competitive broadband because most people only have 1 or 2 options. And really, in economics, 3 providers would be a competitive marketplace. 2 and 1 is not competitive to like force prices to a competitive level. And then some people can afford something, but not the full cost of broadband, even if it was compatible, even if it was competitive. And then some people can't afford anything, which is where like the Affordable Connectivity Program and a lot of other affordability measures really come into play. But that middle class affordability question, like to Alex's point, is something that's still being actively researched and will vary from place to place. So to the extent that you can partner on that and get better data, that's really helpful for trying to figure out what that should be, because to the point about NTIA, we might not ever get clear guidance from the federal government about what that looks like. So we have to start in our own communities to figure out what that looks like to us.
Yeah. We also have to consider what kind of equipment and setup that folks have at home, because we, those are all factors. And sometimes the layperson is not aware that the age of their computer or the type of router that they have will influence what kinds of speeds they have access to. We have a town here in Maine that is working on a low income program to provide people with routers, which is really exciting.
Cool. All right, we might have time for 2 more. I'll do 1 more from the pre-registrants, and then if anyone wants to throw more questions in the chat to try to get in one last question, please do so. So let's see, we have got, all right, here's a good one. How will projects already receiving other funding or an application review under other programs be tracked? Anybody want to take that one? That's super important for local jurisdictions on the ground planning and trying to put together applications to be aware of, so that you can shape your application. Kirsten, is this a you?
Sure, I can.
I guess what I get to do as moderator.
Yeah, so I think states will have to include in the initial proposal just a list of current and ongoing funding projects, which is great. And then another place that we always tell people to start is the federal government has a map that shows where most pre-existing obligations are going to be. So just looking at that is a really good way to track what projects are being built out and where.
Awesome.
Kristen, it's a great point. One of the things that we've been trying hard to do is track and visualize that in real time as well, which is both allowing for us to augment and enhance our data platform and to be able to track and share impact as well. And so I'm sorry, I feel like I'm putting just so many links in the chat, so hopefully it's not too much, but on our homepage, scrolling down about halfway is a visualization of not just where infrastructure and planning awards have been made, but also where a visualization and representation of our service categories as well, which will also dovetail with the grant portal that applicants will be able to plan their programs around.
Yeah, states are also, again, state broadband offices, like you were saying. I think Wisconsin also has a pretty good one. They have maps tracking what's being built out. So like, for example, my house is being built out right now, and you can see what funding is available and where that came from. So it's definitely accurate and like in time.
Wisconsin's maps have been verified.
Yeah, one spot.
Love it. Love it. All right, everyone. We have 1 minute left. Let's see if there's any other questions that we haven't gotten to. Single word answers.
Alex,
yeah, go for
ahead.
it. We could just do closing, wrap up. Everyone's probably got other meetings. I was ambitious with one more question. Go ahead, Andrew.
Oh, I just with an organization with like Next Century Cities and Center on Rural Innovation and the work that you all do, one of the key things that we are seeing as a real need is the data literacy among the civil service. Right, the public sector has a very real challenge in getting up to speed on all the broadband digital equity stuff. Building out the data literacy and the knowledge and the capacity such that the public sector is able to be an adequate partner with the private sector, I think is going to be a very key way, whether it's community-owned infrastructure or not, public involvement and engagement and awareness to hold accountable and to maximize the impact, I feel like is a very real important part of your work.
Perfect way to wrap up. Appreciate it. Thank you so much for attending, everyone, and Andrew and Jessica. As a reminder, if you have any questions at all or you want one-on-one advice and feedback, please send us an email. We're happy to help and be in touch about the next session next month, and hope to see you again. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.